This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 418 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the questions this week, because this is a mailbag episode, I just want to remind you once again that we've got another listener league for all FanDuel Podcast Network listeners. Enter the rake-free weekly NFL contest made exclusively for you, the listener. It's just $5, and you can compete for your share of $2,000 in total prizes, including a $200 first place prize. To enter, visit fanduel.com/league/listener league. Eligibility restrictions apply. Now let's get to these questions. The first question this week is from @NotifBurner. How frustrating is it when the Cowboys prove exactly why you go for two when down 9 and then have all the talking heads call the decision a, quote, head scratcher, even with the hindsight of seeing it work? Yeah, it's mind-blowing. I know this is a fantasy football show first and foremost, but I also talk about analytics sometimes. But this isn't even analytics, you guys. This is just logic. What this question is referring to is when a team is trying to come back in a game, and let's say with like 5 minutes left, which was the case with the Cowboys, a team scores and they're down by 9 as a result. So they still have to kick the extra point or they can go for 2. What you hear on your televisions is talking heads saying, oh, you've got to kick the extra point because that makes it a 1-score game. But that's wrong. Like, that's logically wrong. What you really should do is go for 2 at that moment. Because if you miss it, you know what you're working with. You know that you have to have 2 possessions to win the game. Whereas if you wait until your last touchdown, you won't have that time to come back. Because think of it this way. You score that touchdown and you kick an extra point, which, by the way, an extra point is not automatic these days. More teams should be going for 2 in general, you could argue, because of expected points. But regardless, you score the touchdown, you make the extra point, and now you're down 8. Now you think it's a 1-score game. You get the ball again with like 2 minutes left, let's say. You drive down the field. And you try to milk the clock and score at the perfect moment so that you don't give the other team the ball with any time left. So you score with no time left. Now you need to convert that 2-point conversion. Your odds of converting that 2-point try is no different then than it would be after your previous touchdown. If there was a dramatic difference, then sure, the talking heads have a point. But if we're assuming a miss on the previous touchdown, we have to assume a miss on this one. And if you miss the 2-point try at the end of the game's over. It's done. You lost. At least if you're missing it on the first touchdown with 5 minutes left, you can play faster because you know what you're working with. Or in the Cowboys' case, you can play for an onside kick and hope that you get that in order to get a victory. Even if those odds are slim. Those odds are still better than not having any chance at all. Look, I could talk for an hour on this topic, but I'll just leave it at that. Teams should be going for 2 earlier than they are in these situations. You shouldn't just be playing for a 1-score game. And not only that, you shouldn't just be playing for a tie to force overtime. But that's for another discussion. This has questions from @NoMeatinTeam. How should we be viewing Diggs' rest of season? Is this a sell-high situation or something more? So I wasn't in on Diggs this year, and that looks like a pretty big mistake, which will happen. I hate to break it to you guys, but I get stuff wrong. Diggs has a 27.5% target share through 2 games. That's likely not sustainable. I highly doubt he has that high of a target share by season's end, but I do think he can be around that 24 or 25% range. So he's really not that far off. The thing that's been encouraging about this offense is that they've actually been pretty pass heavy. That was one of the big turnoffs for me entering the year and why I didn't like Diggs. But they have a 1.47 pass to rush ratio in neutral game script so far. The average is 1.32. I don't know if that keeps up, but Diggs has the right type of target share to thrive in that kind of environment. And then on top of that, he's seeing targets down the field. He's 7th in the NFL in air yards. I'm not going to have take lock with Stefon Diggs here because we're being presented some new information. I'm not sure they continue to be as pass heavy as they've been, but it's a very good sign. And Josh Allen has been really good with his deep ball passing this year. No one has more yards on passes, 15 or more air yards this year, than Josh Allen. The schedule eventually gets a little bit tougher, but all evidence suggests that Diggs is going to be solid. I can't sit here and say that there are bad marks for Stephon Diggs, especially since he's a really good wide receiver. That was never in doubt. So I would be holding. This last question is from @nbirch12. Where do you see Hawkinson's value rest of season with Kenny Golladay coming back? I got this question a lot this week, so I figured that I would talk about it on the show. Hawkinson's been somewhat of a disappointment through 2 games. He's the tight end 9, so the ranking isn't all that bad, but he's seen fewer than 13% of Detroit's targets. I don't think that really changes when Babytron comes back, because it's not like it was inflated in the first place because Babytron wasn't playing. The players who are going to suffer the most are at wide receiver. Detroit's been giving Danny Amendola almost a 20% target share. Rookie Quintez Cephas has an 18% target share. Marvin Hall is another 6%. Those numbers are going to drop. Hawkinson should be fine. I don't think he has the upside that I thought that he had entering the year, but he's still a lower end tight end 1 from here on out in my eyes. This next question says, what are your top 5 running backs rest of season? So I think it would be tough to not have Alvin Kamara number 1 right now with the injuries to CMC and Saquon Barkley, and just given Kamara's usage. He's getting work in the red zone, and he has a 26% target share through 2 games. That New Orleans regression that I talked about in the offseason, it's happening. We're seeing more rushing touchdowns than passing touchdowns. That's shifting a little bit. I'd probably then put Zeke second because of the scoring potential and the floor that he brings each week with volume. And then I'd probably go Aaron Jones since we're seeing his receiving game usage look pretty awesome. And then probably Josh Jacobs and maybe Jonathan Taylor or Miles Sanders. But I think that you can make arguments for Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire in there too. That's how I generally rank them moving forward. The next question is from @selfaware-homer. How do you handle trades? How do you value players based on your roster? Will you take a worse value in a trade to help the roster? Overall philosophy on how to approach trades? Thanks. So I go over this a lot on the show, but my approach to trading is to, number 1, always do my best to improve my starting lineup. And then number 2, instead of targeting specific players, I target teams. If I have a lot of good wide receivers on my bench, I'll look for a team that needs wide receivers and offer those players up to that team. I think that's the easiest way to package things. Generally speaking, fantasy managers are going to look at how a player is performing and judge a player solely on that production. So they'll likely hate a guy like AJ Green right now, or Allen Robinson. And that's why I talk about the secondary numbers all week on this show, and specifically on the 15 Transaction Show. Because we know regression exists, but the average fantasy manager doesn't generally care a whole lot about regression. So you can try to target individual players. Just make sure you're giving that team what that team needs. And talk to the manager that you're trading with. Have a conversation. See where their head's at. Make it a win-win trade. That's what trading is there for. This next question says, what is your overall philosophy regarding handcuffs? Is it more beneficial to have a handcuff such as Pollard for a Zeke manager, or drop them to get a bench stash like Hamler who could pop? Okay, so a lot of you guys know, but my general philosophy with handcuffing is that it's a waste to do during the draft. During the draft is key here. They're usually the first players that get dropped in your fantasy league. Like, I have a bunch of Tony Pollard and Chase Edmonds now, and I didn't even have to draft them. But if you're going to handcuff, in order to capture upside, it's better to handcuff someone else's running back. Meaning if you have Dalvin Cook, instead of going for Alexander Mattison, go for Tony Pollard. Yes, if Cook goes down, you're screwed. But if Cook doesn't go down, and if Zeke does go down, you're now sitting with a monster team. It's the difference between a floor and a ceiling, and I prefer the ceiling. With that being said, if my team is looking good, and I'm feeling good about where the direction of my team is going in my overall roster, I'll handcuff my own players as the year goes on. So I do think it's still team dependent. I think what your roster looks like matters. I also think there are only maybe 4 handcuffs who should be rostered in a given week right now. There's Tony Pollard, Alexander Mattison, Latavius Murray, and Chase Edmonds. And then the secondary handcuffs being like Benny Snell, maybe Carlos Hyde, and Darrell Williams. But I've done studies on handcuffs. Not only do they not usually pan out in general, but even when an injury occurs to the starter, they usually don't perform at a very high rate. We often get the handcuff wrong too. It's very rare that a handcuff becomes a league-winning type player. But when you're deciding how you want to handcuff, look at your roster and do an assessment. If it's good, then grab a handcuff for a player on your team. Get Pollard if you have Zeke. But get handcuffs in general if your roster is good. You don't need usable players right now. But if you need help and you need sort of a miracle for your roster to look really good, go with the higher upside approach. Get Chase Edmonds if you have Ezekiel Elliott. This next question is from @dbuse87. Love the content and format of the show. Thanks. Rest of season outlook for Keenan Allen if Herbert keeps the starting role. Is he considered a buy? Thanks. My fear with any of the Chargers pass catchers is that it's very unlikely that the team just unleashes Justin Herbert. Like I said in the 10 Trends show this week, no team has been more run heavy in neutral game situations this year than the Chargers. And the defense is looking good, so they'll likely be competitive. And if that's the case, they can maintain that obnoxious run rate. So no, he's not someone I would try to buy. It's unfortunate too because he's just another guy who's awesome at football. But he's not as usable in fantasy football. This next question is from @EdHitman1966. JJ, first time with a mailbag question. Welcome. With the departure of Hopkins from Houston, do you see the possibility that they will depend more on the tight end now and make Jordan Akins or another Houston tight end a viable tight end value with upside? I've stashed Akins in Dynasty and in deeper leagues, yes. So I think he's the right kind of stash. I'm not like crazy bullish on him though, because even in our small sample size to start the year, the Texans are only 3 or so percentage points higher in terms of tight end target share than they were last year. And that's while facing teams that tend to funnel targets to that position. But Akins is currently 5th in the NFL in tight end routes run according to Pro Football Focus. And after this week, that schedule for Houston finally opens up. So I think he's definitely the right type of player to stash if you have room. This next question says, thoughts on Joe Mixon? His number of carries are good, but seeing Bernard out there this year is so frustrating when there is such a talent gap between the two. Yeah, so I think you nailed it within the question. It's very, very clear if you watch Giovanni Bernard versus Joe Mixon, who the better running back is. But Mixon is still seeing similar usage to what he saw last year. My thing, though, is that it should only improve for Joe Mixon. They seemed to want to involve him more as a pass catcher last week before that negative game script really hit. And Cincinnati should only get better moving forward with Joe Burrow. I don't know if I would go out and buy Mixon. I doubt that I would. But I think selling him right now would be kind of a mistake. You'd be selling low. This last question says, give some examples of players worth stashing on the bench. Okay, so I think that you go in either the handcuff direction for running backs, which I already talked about, or the young wide receiver direction who haven't totally broken out yet and might have a shot later in the season. T. Higgins and Chase Claypool are two that I talked about on the 15 Transactions episode earlier this week. I think Miles Boykin is another one. He's got a 19% target share so far this year. But I would really focus on rookie wide receivers, Justin Jefferson, Van Jefferson, players who could build on their target shares or see more work with an injury. That's where my mind goes when talking about stashes on the bench. The last question this week says, should we be concerned about Gallup or is he a potential buy low candidate? I can't imagine Schultz leads the team in targets each week. Yeah, I doubt that happens too. I think if I were to go in one direction with Michael Gallup right now, it would be to buy low, because I do think he's a good wide receiver. But digging deeper, he's actually seen a lot of air yards. He's seen just as many air yards as Robbie Anderson has on 8 fewer targets. He's 23rd in the NFL in air yards. The issue is that he hasn't been targeted at that high of a rate. He only has a 12% target share. Since we're working in small samples though, and since we saw last year how productive he can be, so there is a baseline, I'm not taking that as the end all here. I think he should be closer to 16 or 17% by the end of the season. And given his air yards profile, that would mean he'll be more than usable. So I would be concerned, but not overly concerned. Meaning if the manager with Gallup in your league is overly concerned, you may be able to buy low. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. And if you guys like this show and you're enjoying it so far this season, please do me a favor and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really goes a long way to helping this show. But thanks, everyone. I will be back next week. Enjoy week 3. I'll talk to you then.